As we watch the scenes unfold in Ferguson, Missouri, we are reminded of all of the shooting deaths that happen across this country. Tragedies every single day for families across this nation. So why does this tragedy get so much national attention while so many others do not? It is worth some thought. David Webb is the host of the David Webb Radio Show on SiriusXM Patriot. Leslie Marshall is a syndicated radio talk show host. Both are Fox News contributors. Welcome to both of you. You know, I cannot help but think about the grieving families across this nation who have lost loved ones to violence and wonder how they feel when they see the enormous amount of attention that the death of this young man receives. As I said, we all feel for his mother and for his father and his grandfather. But there are so many families out there who have lost a child to senseless violence. David, what do you think about that?
Well, Martha, one of the things that happens here is it gets attention because you have a young black man being shot by a police officer who's white. Therefore, you get the dynamic of police and citizen. And then, of course, that's just more newsworthy as the organizations see it. There's a bit of irresponsibility here, however. When you have the numbers of people being shot in cities like Chicago, the individual tragedies, whatever city it may be in, they're not getting the coverage because they're not deemed newsworthy. But by the numbers, there's certainly parents who are hurting, parents who have lost their children. So there's a responsibility on the media here. The other side of this is you get the typical, what I call the grievance industry that goes out there, where it's more about the narrative and the court of public opinion rather than the facts and the investigation that needs to play out. And tragically, in Ferguson, protests, peaceful protests, by concerned citizens are polluted by instigators, thugs, criminals, the new Black Panther Party, and all these other elements. You know, there's so often we jump to conclusions, and I'm just reminded of one case, and it's different because this is not a case that involves police, but the case of Brendan Tevlin in New Jersey, 19 years old. He was gunned down in his family car by 3 individuals who have now been taken into custody, and they're charged with his murder. I think we have a picture of them as well. And, you know, the pain that is felt by his family, and I can only imagine his community watches this and says, you know, where was the outrage over what happened to this boy? Leslie, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I have to say, almost everything David said this morning, I agree with. I've lived in Chicago, and there's certainly outrage there, as there was with this young man. But there is a reality, and the reality is the media covers things like a paper, for example, that are going to sell papers. And people love when it has to do with law enforcement and a citizen. People seem to love, in a voyeuristic way, the divide with race. Now, I know there was a divide with race in this case that you just cited with this young man, but for some reason, when it's white on black crime, there is more outrage and more people are interested. It seems like when there's black on black crime or when there's black on white crime, whites just aren't as interested, and the media is just not as interested in covering it.
Yeah, I mean, there was a young boy, Devontae Cathan, 17 years old, riding his bicycle this week in Chicago at 11:30 at night. He was shot and killed. I mean, I guess, you know, even on the part of society, forget the press for a moment, David, but where's the outrage among people? You know, we talked so much this week about peaceful protest and how it's merited in this country. And are we asleep? Do we not see the devastation in these other cases that I have just shown? You know, perhaps there should be more peaceful protests to draw more people's attention to what's actually going on in the streets of this country, David.
Martha, there needs to be, and you hit the nail on the head, the people. We're the ones who consume the media. We watch it, we read it, we click on it online. It's time that we decide that it's more important to look at the overall issue. You have a case of Tevlin. This is a young man, graduated from Seton Hall Prep, a school I know well. Usually someone with a bright future, murdered by 3 black youth, and he doesn't get the outrage. Not a new case, Oklahoma, just a year ago or so, where there was a young Australian man murdered, again, shot down in a thrill kill. Frankly, to the people of America, stop surrendering your, quote, leadership to these community leaders like Al Sharpton and others who gin up this black-white dynamic the way Leslie described it when not paying attention to the issue, which is the terrible tragedy of murders that are committed against against innocent civilians, regardless of the color dynamic, and frankly, the hypocrisy of not giving the same attention to a white kid murdered by 3 black men. What, is his life not as valuable as Michael Brown's, or vice versa?
Leslie?
David, I do agree with you there, and certainly every person, every child's life is and should be as valuable. David, you know this much more than I do because you are an African American and you are a male and you were an African American teen male. I certainly have been and never will be any of those. I think when we look at, you know, the history in this community, the oppression, the lack of trust. I heard this morning a woman in Ferguson whose son was arrested with handcuffs, 14 years old, for skateboarding. When you have that feeling, when you have the constant oppression, when you have the constant lack of trust, and when you feel so leery of law enforcement, this is like a powder keg. This is what we've seen in Ferguson. And speaking of, if we just had peaceful protests, which I certainly hope and pray that we would have in Ferguson, the press wouldn't be there en masse as they are with
but
the cops.
The point is that peaceful protest is a right. And perhaps, you know, we need to use it to bring attention to so many more of these cases, because there are children all across this country whose families are mourning as his family is today. And we want to remember all of them to the extent that that is possible. Leslie and David, thank you very much for being with us today.